Would you have the courage to hear a killer's last words? This question in itself already carries an uncomfortable weight, and that is exactly what makes it impossible to ignore. Because behind the crimes, the coldness, and the headlines that shock the world, there is a human being about to face the end. And on this extreme line between life and death, hidden truths, suppressed regrets, and unexpected confessions can finally come to light. Imagine being in front of someone sentenced to death, and he decides to tell you something that no one knew. The scene is silent. Time seems suspended. The clock on the wall ticks down to the last minutes before the execution. The man, handcuffed, stares at you. His eyes no longer hold arrogance or fury. There is something different there. A deep tiredness, perhaps, or a sincere desire to be heard one last time. And then, his voice low and steady, he begins to speak. What would you do? Would you have the courage to listen until the end? We are often quick to judge what we don't understand. But what goes through the mind of someone about to die for their crimes? Is there real regret? Do these last words have the power to change something or someone? What you will discover now may surprise you, because the silence before death is not always empty. Sometimes it is filled with stories that never came to light. Have you ever wondered why some murderers, precisely in their final moments, decide to open their hearts? What moves them? Was it guilt, fear, or just a desperate attempt to leave something behind? Stay with me until the end, because we will explore the emotional and psychological behind the scenes of these last-minute confessions, understanding what they reveal and what they still hide. The truth is that the human mind is much more complex than any sentence, and when placed against the wall, faced with the inevitable end, this mind can reveal facets to us that challenge everything we believe about good, evil, justice, and redemption. We're talking about real stories, real people, and as disturbing as they may be, they carry lessons that you may never have stopped to think about. Prepare to delve into territory where morality is constantly put to the test, where the line between villain and victim is not always as clear as it seems. What you will hear is not easy, it's not light, but it is necessary, and perhaps by listening to these last words you will discover much more about human nature than you realize. And now that the silence has been broken, what comes next may shake you in unexpected ways. And now that the silence has been broken, what comes next may shake you in unexpected ways. But before proceeding, tell me, what have you felt so far? This story, however uncomfortable it may be, forces us to face what we often prefer to ignore. And perhaps that is precisely where the value of this type of reflection lies. So if this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what touched you most. It could be an opinion, a doubt, or even a personal experience that you have already lived and that, in some way, connects with all of this. Your voice also matters, a lot. Every comment, every like, every new subscription here on the channel is what keeps this conversation alive. It's what allows us to continue bringing intense themes, stories that provoke, that challenge, that don't go unnoticed. When you interact, you help this content reach more people. People who might need to hear exactly this today. So, if you believe in the power of stories that go beyond the obvious, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. This way, you don't miss anything that's yet to come. And believe me, there's a lot ahead that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew. Because what is about to be revealed goes far beyond the words of a condemned man. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject. After all, what makes someone in their last minutes of life choose to break the silence? Why, after so long hiding truths, lies, or feelings, does a killer finally decide to speak? What's behind these latest confessions? That's exactly what we're about to explore. What these dying words reveal, and why they deserve to be heard. The objective of this video is not to romanticize crimes or victimize those who chose to follow the path of violence, but rather opening a space for reflection on something that many people avoid: the emotional and psychological impact that lives behind the scenes of a criminal mind, especially in the final moments, when there are no more masks, no escape, possible. At this time, what emerges is often pure, raw, and deeply revealing. In criminal psychology, there is an intriguing consensus. A death row inmate's last words can be as significant as their actions in life. They can carry a symbolic weight of regret, denial, revolt, or even something much more disturbing: absolute coldness. And in some rare cases, confessions that completely change the interpretation of a crime, revealing a hidden truth that has remained hidden for years, and that only comes to light when death approaches. This is not fiction. It's real. They are final fragments of human stories marked by extreme choices. When analyzed in depth, these final words become pieces of a puzzle that helps to better understand how the mind of someone who goes beyond all moral limits works. And, more than that, it forces us to reflect on our own humanity, our judgments, fears, and the way we see right and wrong. There are documentary records, case studies, and even interviews given minutes before the execution that show how much these confessions say more about the transformation, or lack thereof, than any technical report. When a convict decides to speak, it's not just what he says that matters, but how he says it, who he says it to, and why he decided to say it at that exact moment. These elements reveal the internal construction of someone who lived on the limit between reason and the abyss. What is often noticed is that even in the face of death, not everyone shows regret. Some maintain coldness, emotional distance, and even arrogance, as if they were above their own sentence. Others, however, break inside. They cry, ask for forgiveness, talk about childhood traumas, abuse suffered, devastating losses, in a desperate attempt to reconnect with something that once made them human. And there are still those who surprise with unexpected revelations, such as secrets that have never been told, details of crimes that have not yet been solved, or the names of accomplices that had never been mentioned. These moments are filled with tension, but also with a strange kind of clarity. Because when time runs out, what remains is just the essence, naked, unfiltered. And that's why studying these confessions goes beyond morbid curiosity. It's about understanding extreme mental processes, about seeking answers in a terrain where almost no one wants to tread. It's like trying to read the soul in its last breaths. More than that, it is a journey that invites us to reflect on our own limits, our decisions, and how far we are capable of going in search of redemption or power. Analyzing these final lines is also a way of understanding the impact that a choice can have, not only on the life of the person who makes it, but on everything and everyone around them. It is an exercise in empathy, yes, but also in lucidity, because when we look closely at what many prefer to keep at bay, we discover how much there is still to be understood about human behavior. And perhaps the most disconcerting thing is to realize that behind the monstrosity, there is always a story. Not every story justifies an act, it's true, but every story has an origin. And to ignore that origin is to close your eyes to what really moves the gears of the mind. That's why a convict's last minutes can be as revealing as entire years of investigations. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too, to show that you are willing to look deeper, beyond the label, beyond the fear. Now I want to expand this conversation even further by bringing a broader perspective. Where does this practice of giving voice to the condemned in their last moments come from? Why, even over the centuries, have such different societies maintained this ritual, almost as a collective need to listen to those who are about to cross the final line? The tradition of last words was not born by chance. In many cultures since ancient times, the moments before death carried an almost sacred symbolism. In medieval public executions, for example, it was common for the condemned to have the chance to address the crowd. Sometimes with screams of hatred, sometimes with prayers, or even with a silence full of meanings. The final speech was considered a form of revelation, as if at that moment the person let their true nature slip. And the public, who was there to watch the outcome, also wanted to hear something that confirmed the justice of the sentence, or that left any doubts hanging in the air. This phenomenon has crossed time. From the European scaffold to modern death row in maximum security prisons in the United States, the last words continue to be recorded. In some American states, they are officially part of the execution protocol. The condemned person is asked if they want to say something, and everything is transcribed. The reason? Partly because of tradition, partly because of legal documentation, but also because there is a deep, almost instinctive sense that what is said in the face of the and can carry a hidden truth, something that someone may have hidden their entire life. In Eastern cultures, this moment was also, and in some cases still is, treated with extreme respect. In the samurai tradition, for example, records of farewells before seppuku, ritual suicide, show how the last speech was considered an expression of honor, philosophy, and mental clarity, a final reflection of the soul. In indigenous tribes, there are reports of rites of passage where the speech of the dying person was heard as a way of guiding the living, a kind of spiritual legacy. The curious thing is that even with the advancement of science, technology, and modern criminal justice, this practice is still alive, perhaps because behind every judgment there is still the search for meaning, a human need to understand, to complete the story, to hear the outcome of the narrative, whether to close it or to reopen wounds that never really healed. And at this point, psychology meets the past, because that final line isn't just a dramatic element, it's a mirror. It shows what that person became after everything they experienced. It shows whether there was a real transformation, a change in mentality, or whether the essence remained intact, unchanging, cold. It is in this speech that we can see signs of repentance, redemption, or a complete disconnection with any trace of empathy. The tradition of last words also reveals a lot about us as a society. It shows how much we still value, or fear, the idea that the truth can emerge at the last second. It shows how much we are still moved by stories, by endings, by confessions. There is something almost ritualistic about it all, sitting, listening, witnessing. And this act, as simple as it may seem, has the power to change perceptions, to provoke new questions, to open paths for much deeper debates than just right and wrong. There is also an ethical layer behind this practice. Why do we offer this right to speech to those who took this same right from their victims? Why give this last space to those who caused so much suffering? These are difficult, uncomfortable questions, but they are part of the complexity of the topic. By allowing these final words to exist, perhaps we are acknowledging that even in the face of the cruelest acts, we still want to understand. We still search for meaning. And it is at this point that the last words go beyond the individual and become material for study, reflection, and even collective transformation. Because when we listen carefully, we can see the impact not only of the crime, but of an entire trajectory of decisions, influences, systemic failures, and emotional absences that many times contributed to that tragic outcome. These reports, when analyzed carefully, offer clues about patterns of behavior, about unresolved traumas, about cycles of violence that are repeated, and understanding these patterns is one of the most powerful ways to break them. Therefore, studying the last words goes far beyond the drama. It is about rebuilding the path to the abyss, step by step, to prevent others from following the way. Same route. Write it in the comments. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that mindful listening to even the most controversial voices can teach us more than we realize. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this journey, looking directly at what happens inside someone's mind in the face of imminent death. Not what is seen from the outside, and such as the expression on the face or the tone of voice, but what is stirring internally, in the deepest layers of consciousness. What does the brain do when it knows there is no turning back? When time finally becomes finite and the only certainty left is the end? It is at this limit moment that the most primitive and, at the same time, most complex mental mechanisms of the human being come into action. Foreshadowed death, different from sudden death, allows the mind a kind of final adjustment, an almost desperate attempt to find meaning, repair damage, or simply endure what lies ahead. And this is where three very common reactions arise: cognitive dissonance, regret, and denial. Cognitive dissonance happens when thoughts and values conflict internally. Imagine someone who spent their life coldly justifying their crimes, claiming that the victims deserved it, or that it was all part of a larger system. But now, about to die, this person's mind begins to give way. The narrative built over years no longer holds up in the face of the end. The image of oneself begins to crack, and it is at this point that the final words can carry confessions, or at least sincere doubts. It's as if the brain, in a last attempt to preserve some internal coherence, tried to reorganize everything, albeit belatedly. Regret, in turn, is one of the most potent emotions at this moment, but also one of the most complex. Sometimes it appears in a genuine way, the result of a conscience that awakens there, at the limit, when there is nothing left to lose. Other times, repentance is confused with fear of eternal punishment, fear of divine judgment, or even fear of oblivion. The mind, faced with death, can seek symbolic forms of redemption. And that's why many requests for forgiveness sound like attempts to rewrite part of history itself. Not to change the facts, but to not come out of it as the absolute villain. Denial, on the other hand, is a classic mechanism, and in some people it remains until the last second. There are convicts who, even in the face of irrefutable evidence, deny their actions until the end. This doesn't just happen because of cynicism or manipulation. In many cases, it is an unconscious defense process. Admitting what was done would mean confronting unbearable guilt. And the brain, at this point, prefers to distort reality rather than face the real impact of its own actions. The silence of many condemned people, therefore, also speaks. It talks about deep emotional blocks, about the inability to deal with one's own story. All of this shows that although execution is a physical act, it is preceded by an intense psychological battle. And this internal duel is what makes each final line so full of meaning. There are those who say loose, meaningless words. There are those who speak angrily. Others just murmur a name, a memory, an enigmatic phrase that leaves more questions than answers. But behind every sound is a brain trying to deal with something it was never really programmed to accept: extinction itself. Science, in fact, has already observed specific neurological reactions in this final stage. Sudden bouts of lucidity, vivid childhood memories, hallucinations, or even a strange peace, as if something had completely surrendered. All of this can happen. And all of this shapes the content and tone of the last words. It's not just what you mean, it's what you mean it needs to say. And often, not even the convict himself knows exactly why he chose those words. This leads us to an even deeper understanding of human nature. Because when we are placed against the edge of existence, our truest layers tend to emerge. Fear, guilt, affection, forgotten memories, beliefs that seemed dormant. Everything comes to the surface. It's as if the mind starts searching every corner of the story itself in search of something that makes sense. And it is precisely in this process that the most unexpected revelations emerge. It is impossible to predict how someone will react to the end. Some remain firm, cold, distant. Others fall apart. Some turn to spirituality, others to humor. There are those who cry compulsively. There are those who smile. And each of these reactions tells us something about that person's trajectory, about their decisions, their losses, their emptiness. Analyzing this behavior is a deep dive into how our emotions work when faced with what we cannot control. And, as dark as the subject matter is, it is also deeply human, because it confronts us with the fragility of life, with the consequences of choices, with the behind the scenes of what we are capable of feeling when there is no more time. Studying these reactions, therefore, is an exercise in empathy. Even when empathy seems impossible, it's looking at each other and understanding that even in the face of irreversible things, there is still an entire universe pulsing inside. Comment there. That makes sense to me. If you also believe that, ultimately, understanding the human mind is an essential step toward understanding the world around us. Now I want to bring this subject to an even more concrete level. Get out of the theory, mental mechanisms, and scientific explanations for a bit, and dive into a real case. the kind that makes us question everything we understand about guilt, regret, and truth. Because it's one thing to analyze the concept of redemption. It's another to hear the words of someone who took lives, see their face moments before death, and try to decipher if there is sincerity in what is being said, or if everything is just a carefully constructed act. The case I want to share now took place in the United States, and still today provokes debates among psychologists, lawyers, scholars of the criminal mind, and even victims' families. This is James David Autry, a man sentenced to death in 1983 for the brutal murder of 3 people during a convenience store robbery in Texas. The crime was committed coldly, and the evidence left little room for doubt. Autry shot an employee, a customer, and a 14-year-old teenager, all killed at close range. The motivation was banal: cash money. None of those involved offered resistance. He killed because he could. During the trial and the years that followed, Autry was arrogant and unapologetic. For a long time, he maintained a stance that prosecutors called indifferent to human life. But something began to change when the execution was scheduled. In his final days, he began giving interviews, writing letters, and for the first time speaking publicly about what he had done. And that's when the doubts began. In his last statement before the execution, made while lying on the stretcher, Autry said, "I would like to ask forgiveness from those who stayed. I know that what I did cannot be undone, but if there is any comfort in the fact that I deeply understood the weight of my actions, then I accept dying with this guilt on me." The voice was shaking. He cried. He paused for a long time, and he ended by saying, "I hope my last words are not seen as empty excuses, but as a truth that took too long to be born." Many people who followed the case were moved. One of the guards present said he saw a completely different man from the one who entered death row. Some journalists wrote that it was one of the most moving lines ever heard at an execution in Texas. But the question that remains unanswered, and that may never have a definitive answer, is, was that true regret or emotional manipulation? This is where the layers blend. Because Autry knew he was being filmed. He knew that his words would be publicized, analyzed, commented on. I knew that in some way I could still make an impact on the world. And when we know we are being watched, it is almost impossible not to perform, even unconsciously. This does not necessarily mean that everything was false, but it also doesn't guarantee that it was real. Psychologists who have studied the case say there are signs of authentic regret, especially in the way he began to express himself while still alive. Before of the date of execution. The records show gradual changes in behavior, greater cooperation with prison professionals, and even demonstrations of empathy in private conversations. On the other hand, family members of the victims were skeptical. One of the sisters of one of the victims said in an interview, "He had years to feel something. He waited until the last day. That's not regret, that's fear." And then we find ourselves faced with an issue that goes far beyond Autry's case. When someone says they're sorry, how do you know if it's true? And more, to what extent does it matter if it's true or not, when the time to fix it has passed? This kind of doubt is what makes last words so powerful and so dangerous, because at the same time as they can be a sincere mirror of transformation, they can also be the last attempt to manipulate the narrative, to provoke emotion, to seek some kind of impact. And the truth is that we as a society still have a very strong tendency to romanticize the last moment, to think that just because someone is dying, everything they say is pure, legitimate, true. But will it be? Perhaps what is most frightening in this case, and in so many others, is not the uncertainty about the sincerity of the repentance, but rather the fact that even when a killer appears vulnerable, we still can't be sure what's real. Because the human mind has the ability to both genuinely transform itself and create a perfect mask. And sometimes even those who are speaking no longer know which part is true and which is an act. This is the type of reflection that escapes the field of punishment and enters directly into the territory of human nature, because it talks about decisions, about identity, about what makes us change. or pretend to change. And mainly, about how we seek meaning even in the gestures of those who chose to destroy. Write it in the comments. I'm on this journey too. If this kind of story makes you think deeper about what regret really is, and what might just be a truth hidden in pretty words. Now, contrary to what we saw in James David Autry, there is another type of personality, another type of attitude towards imminent death, which goes beyond manipulation or the search for redemption. We are talking about an almost inhuman coldness, a behavior so far removed from empathy and regret that it makes us question, to what extent can the human mind disconnect from the reality of its own actions? How can we understand someone who, as he approaches his execution, clearly says that he would do it all over again, without even a shadow of regret? The case of Ted Bundy, one of the most infamous criminals in American history, is a perfect example of this type of mentality. Bundy was responsible for a series of murders of women during the 70s and 80s. He was charismatic, intelligent, and knew how to manipulate those around him. However, when it came to his victims, his indifference was shocking. He felt no remorse. In his final interview, shortly before he was executed in 1989, Bundy made a statement that left the world perplexed. When asked about the reason for his crimes, he was unrepentant. Instead, he said, "I regret not doing more. I did what I needed to do. Everything I did was necessary for me, and I'm not ashamed of that." Those words are scary, aren't they? The simple fact that he shows no regret is disturbing, but what leaves us even more perplexed is what he said next. "I was in a dark place, but it's what I needed. It's not my fault." Ted Bundy's mind was marked by a combination of factors that, together, created behavior completely devoid of empathy. Psychologists who have studied Bundy's case believe he exhibited clear signs of psychopathy and narcissism. A psychopath is someone who, among other things, displays a lack of empathy and remorse, impulsive behavior, and a deep desire for control and power over others. Narcissism, although it can manifest itself in more subtle ways, is also related to the idea of superiority, with the belief that one's actions are justified, no matter the cost to others. What's most impressive about Bundy's case is how he was able to depersonalize his victims. He saw them as objects, not as human beings, and seemed to take pleasure not only in the act of crime, but also in manipulating the emotions of those around him. So when he says that, "I would do it all again," this is not just a simple declaration of coldness. This is a reflection of a worldview where he considered himself above any morality, where his actions were justified by his own distorted vision of control and power. Criminal psychology teaches us that psychopaths, like Bundy, have a brain that works differently. He does not feel the same emotional activation in situations involving the pain or suffering of others. Instead of compassion, he feels a kind of excitement or pleasure. And in Bundy's case, this lack of empathy was accompanied by a deep sense of superiority, as if he were capable of controlling the lives of others without any consequences. This combination of psychopathy and narcissism is not rare among notorious criminals, but Ted Bundy's case stands out for the way he positioned himself in the face of his own death. He wasn't trying to apologize, he wasn't trying to manipulate anyone into forgiving him, he just didn't care. For him, death did not represent the end of his journey, but another transition, another way to reinforce the idea that he was in control, even in the face of inevitability. When the human mind is capable of disconnecting so deeply from reality, of not recognizing the pain and suffering it has caused, what is left for it? How can we analyze behavior like this without being overcome by a certain type of incredulity? What we do know is that Bundy's psychological profile presents us with one of the most extreme forms of distortion of reality and empathy, and this makes us reflect. To what extent are we prepared to deal with human beings who, instead of repenting or seeking redemption, simply rid themselves of any feeling of guilt? Now, I want to invite you to go even deeper into this journey, because the impact of this behavior is broader than we imagine. Stay with me and let's explore more about what's behind this total lack of regret. Let's try to understand where this emptiness comes from. What is inside a human being capable of committing such atrocities and still not regret it? Because contrary to what many expect, the real reason behind this is much more complex than just pure evil. There is a psychological construct that we need to understand which reveals a lot about human nature itself. Comment there. That makes sense to me, if you are also pondering the depths of the human mind and how we can begin to understand such extreme behaviors. Now let's talk about something even more fascinating and at the same time disturbing. Imagine yourself faced with a person about to be executed who decides in the last moments of his life to reveal a crime that no one knew about. Hidden crimes, secrets buried for years and that for some reason come to light at the most unthinkable moment. This really happens. There are cases in which prisoners already convicted and awaiting the execution of their sentences begin to make shocking revelations in their final moments. Many of these confessions end up revealing crimes that not even the police knew about, revelations that are so shocking that they reopen investigations and can change the course of several lives, even decades later. And the most intriguing thing is that these confessions do not come from people who show regret. On the contrary, many of these criminals seem to act with the intention of exposing something that, until then, had been hidden, as if they wanted to leave one last mark on the world before leaving. A striking example is the case of Henry Lee Lucas, a man who spent years on death row after confessing to multiple murders. When Lucas was about to be executed, he made a series of bombastic statements. He began to claim that in addition to the crimes for which he was already convicted, he had committed several other homicides, many of which had never been investigated. He began to reveal vivid, often grotesque details of crimes that, until that point, were unknown to authorities. Most of these confessions, however, were shrouded in much controversy. Many believe that Lucas was just trying to generate one last sense of notoriety, or even manipulate the situation in his favor, as he was never able to present concrete evidence to corroborate his stories. However, the most impressive thing about this story is that despite the doubts and controversial nature of their allegations, some of these confessions ended up reopening investigations and generating new searches for missing victims. How is this possible? How can a man sentenced to death change so many investigations with just a few words? And was he really revealing the truth or just wanting to make one last move to make himself even more remembered? These questions remain without definitive answers. Another case worth highlighting is that of David Berkowitz, the infamous son of Sam, responsible for a series of murders in New York during the 1970s. Berkowitz, after being arrested and convicted, also made startling revelations before his execution. In a moment of reflection, he stated that he did not act alone in the murders and revealed details of a secret network of accomplices. These confessions, although initially met with skepticism, sparked an investigation into a possible crime network that for a long time was ignored by authorities. This revelation caused many people to question whether the true motive for his crimes was actually what he claimed, or whether there was something darker behind his actions. And we can't forget to Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who, after being convicted of 49 murders, made an unexpected revelation. During the years he was imprisoned, Ridgway confessed to crimes that no one had linked to him until then. It detailed the murder of several women, which caused police to reopen old investigations and review unsolved missing persons cases across a wide swath of the United States. Ridgway's confession not only ended years of uncertainty for victims' families, but also reopened investigations that already seemed lost in time. These stories, however dark and shocking they may be, bring to light a truth about the human mind, especially that of criminals with a twisted mind. No matter how close the end gets, there is still the need to impose oneself on the world, to leave a mark. The revelation of a hidden crime, a kept secret, is a way of reaffirming control, of remaining in some way relevant even in the face of the inevitable. Now, imagine yourself in the position of someone who, after years of trying to understand the motivations behind a crime, sees an unexpected confession and comes across a hidden truth, something that reopens old cases and sheds new light on what we thought we knew. Isn't it surprising how those last words can have so much power? How can simple phrases uttered by those on the verge of death shed a new light on the past? The psychological impact of these confessions is, without a doubt, profound. They not only affect the investigations themselves, but affect those involved, the families of the victims and even the investigators themselves. In the end, these words may represent the last piece of an incomplete puzzle, or even a new enigma to be solved, which brings to light a new perspective on a crime or on human nature itself. Now I want to invite you to reflect more deeply on this phenomenon. What makes someone at their last moment reveal secrets that could change the entire course of history? Were these confessions a desperate attempt at redemption, or a final strategy of control? What do these unexpected revelations tell us about human behavior and what people really think when they know the end is near? Comment there. I'm on this journey too. If you're also reflecting on the impact a simple confession can have on our understanding of the past, justice, and human nature. Now let's explore another deep layer of this phenomenon of last words. Something that is not always discussed, but that has a huge impact. The effect of these confessions on victims and authorities. What happens when someone, in the last moments of their life, reveals something so disturbing that it shakes the emotional foundations of whoever is listening? How do these words resonate in the lives of people who have already gone through so much suffering? Or even in the professionals themselves who, with a facade of impersonality, deal with these situations day after day? Imagine the family members of victims of a brutal crime, those who have lived with the pain of loss for years trying to rebuild their lives. For them, the death of the criminal can represent, in many cases, the end of a cycle, a closure. But what about when, in the final moments of an execution, the criminal makes an unexpected confession or a chilling statement? How can these words change the perception of family members or even reopen wounds that were beginning to heal? It's hard to imagine the emotional turmoil someone must go through upon hearing a confession like that. On the one hand, there may be a feeling of relief that something has finally been said. Perhaps it is a piece of truth that has been sought so much, a key that fits into the unanswered questions. But on the other hand, there is the weight of doubt. What goes through a family member's mind when they hear a criminal's last speech? Do they really believe what is being said? Or could it be that in a moment of desperate attempt to redeem himself, the criminal tries to once again manipulate those he has deeply hurt? And this doubt is not exclusive to family members. Imagine the impact that these confessions can have on the police officers, investigators, or even professionals in the penitentiary system who, no matter how trained they are to deal with the cold side of justice, are still human. They know that one word, one sentence can change not only the course of a case, but the very perception of the work they do. Sometimes they are the first to hear these words. They are the ones who, after years of investigation and impersonal decisions, are in charge of witnessing this final revelation. There is a humanity to this that cannot be ignored, and here an important ethical question arises. Do they deserve to hear this? When a criminal, about to be executed, decides to make one last confession, what is the true purpose behind it? Are you finally trying to redeem yourself for your actions? Or is it a final manipulation, an attempt to leave an indelible mark on everyone's memory? In many cases, the nature of the confessions places those involved in a morally uncomfortable situation. What is more important, the truth revealed or the psychological impact of hearing something so disturbing? What to do when the criminal, at the end of his life, tries to place the weight of his evil once again on the shoulders of those who were left behind? The weight of these words can be even more intense when it comes to unsolved crimes, mysteries that have never been solved. When a criminal reveals a new crime, or when he makes an unexpected confession, a painful chapter for family members and society is reopened. Imagine the parents, spouse, or children of a victim who, after so many years, finally have an answer to the question that haunts them. But at the same time, this response brings more pain, more anguish. The truth that comes as a revelation can be more painful than doubt, because deep down, nothing can bring back what was lost. On the other hand, the attitude of the professionals involved, such as judges, lawyers, and even members of the prison technical staff, is also extremely important. They are trained to deal with the pain, coldness, and complexity of each case, but it is impossible to deny that, like any human being, they have their own reactions to such a strong confession. They also carry the weight of these words reaching a larger audience, causing repercussions beyond what they can often predict. In many situations, these last words can trigger a series of emotional and social repercussions that ultimately transform the case into something much greater than a simple death sentence. And therein lies the tension between what is ethical and what is emotional. A criminal's final words can provide a sense of closure, or conversely, they can further fuel the cycle of pain and suffering. How will these words resonate? How will they affect public perception of the case? Will they be remembered as a genuine attempt at redemption or as a last desperate manipulation by someone who, before leaving, tries to leave a legacy? And most importantly, who decides what is or isn't deserving of hearing this? What makes these words acceptable or justifiable to the people who stay? Now, I want to invite you to reflect on what the idea of justice at the end of life means for you. The impact of a final confession can be transformative for many, but for others, it can be an attempt to escape the weight of guilt. What do you think about this? How do you believe these final words can affect those who hear them? How do they affect the concept of justice and the personal transformation of those involved? Comment there. That makes sense to me if you, too, feel touched by these questions, and if a criminal's last words really have the power to transform the journey of everyone involved. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, exploring how science tries to understand and interpret the last words of criminals. What do psychologists and crime experts have to say about these crucial moments? How does the human mind actually react on the threshold between life and death? To answer these questions, we need to look at some widely accepted theories, in addition to studying the behavior of criminals from a scientific perspective. Let's start with a central figure in the study of psychopathy, Dr. Robert Hare. He is one of the leading experts on psychopathy, and his theories have helped shape the understanding of the behavior of criminals, especially those who commit violent crimes. For Hare, psychopathy is characterized by a lack of empathy, manipulation, and highly selfish behavior. Many criminals who demonstrate indifference or even coldness in their last words fit the profile of psychopaths. Psychopathy, according to Hare, is a complex condition, which can be recognized by the inability to form genuine emotional bonds with others, which translates into callous behaviors, such as not showing regret for cruel actions. Criminal psychology teaches us that a criminal's last words can often be an extension of their previous behavior. In many cases, people with psychopathic characteristics show a total lack of remorse, which can be a decisive factor in how they behave in their final moments. They don't have that emotional connection that many of us would have when facing imminent death. This means that for them, these final words may not be a moment of reflection or regret, but a last opportunity to reaffirm their identity, their beliefs, or even manipulate public perception. Robert Hare, in his work on the psychopathy scale, talks about how these people are incredibly skilled at manipulating others, even in extreme situations. And here's the important point. Lastly, words can be a deliberate strategy, an attempt to stay in control even when death is inevitable. A psychopath's mind without the ability to feel empathy may treat this moment as a performance, a chance to show strength, or in some cases, to try to escape a sentence, even if symbolically. But at the same time, a person's behavior in the face of death is not just a matter of psychopathy. Psychology also deals with something called cognitive dissonance, a concept that may explain the behavior of some criminals in their last words. Cognitive dissonance happens when there is a conflict between a person's beliefs and their actions. In the case of a criminal, this can manifest itself in several ways. Some may try to reduce this internal discomfort by justifying their actions, denying the seriousness of their crimes, or even minimizing their guilt. Others may engage in a process of denial, where they refuse the idea that what they have done is irreparable. This can occur in their last words, where a criminal attempts to change the narrative of their life, trying to convince themselves, or others, that their actions were somehow justified. Criminal psychology studies also address the behavior of criminals in times of great stress, such as on death row. During these moments, the brain is in a state of extreme tension, and this can profoundly affect what someone says. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, famous for his studies on decision-making, explains that under intense stress, our brain tends to protect itself in a way that makes us rationalize and justify decisions, even the most irrational ones. Therefore, a criminal's last words may be an attempt to save his own sanity in the face of imminent doom. Furthermore, neuroscience shows us that imminent death can induce a series of intense physical and psychological responses. When someone knows they are about to die, the brain may release chemicals that create a feeling of relief, and some individuals in this state may even become more lucid and frank about their feelings. It's an interesting paradox. As they approach death, some criminals may finally admit their faults and mistakes, while others may bury themselves even deeper in their denial or psychopathology. Therefore, the last words can be both a reflection of a genuine process of reflection and an attempt at manipulation or emotional self-sufficiency. In the context of the last words, the question of repentance is something that always comes up. Psychologists say that regret, especially in people who have committed serious crimes, is not a simple phenomenon. For many, this regret only arises when death becomes inevitable, which can be a defense mechanism against guilt and suffering. In many cases, the regret expressed by criminals in their final hours may be sincere, but in others, it is simply a way of minimizing the impact of their actions, an attempt to present themselves in a way that is more acceptable to others, or even to their own consciences. And what about hidden crimes, late confessions, as I mentioned before? There is another layer to this scenario that has a lot to do with the criminal's behavior, but also with the way society and authorities deal with these revelations. Psychologists such as Philip Zimbardo, known for the famous Stanford Prison experiment, argue that many human actions, especially the most extreme ones, arise not only from personal characteristics, but also from the circumstances in which people are immersed. Zimbardo talks about how the environment can create gray areas in people's morality, where in certain contexts, even the most normal people can commit acts of violence. This perspective is crucial when trying to understand how a criminal's last words can be more than a simple outburst of guilt or regret, but a reflection of the dynamics that have surrounded him throughout his life and the social forces that have pressured him. Now, I want to invite you to reflect on all of this. When we think about a criminal's last words, it's possible to feel a deep curiosity about what's going on in their minds. Are they genuine or a simple strategy? And how does this affect the way society views these people? There is a hidden truth there, a raw reality that many try to hide or justify. And the most intriguing thing, can we understand these words in light of everything we know about criminal psychology? Or is there always something beyond that? Something that goes beyond what we can explain? Comment there. That makes sense to me if you are also fascinated by this dynamic between the human mind and the last word, and if you have already reflected on how these words can change the narrative of an entire life. Now, I want you to stop for a moment and imagine, what would you say if it was your last minute? What would go through your mind if you knew you were about to end your journey in this world? This is something that few of us really stop to think about, and perhaps that is precisely why the last words of criminals, especially those in extreme situations such as on death row, arouse so much curiosity and, at the same time, so much reflection. Those last words could be everything or nothing. They can be a window into someone's soul, a true revelation of what they thought or felt, or in other cases, they can be a last attempt at manipulation, at rewriting one's own history into something more acceptable. What's behind them? Are they a genuine reflection of the person or a desperate effort to present themselves as something they are not? Did these final words reveal who they really were, or just who they wanted to appear to be? When we think about the types of confessions, we can see a pattern emerging. The repentant, the one who, in his last moments, tries to seek some form of redemption, even if it is too late. He is touched by the understanding of the consequences of his actions and tries, in some way, to express this regret. There is a humanity in this regret, but at the same time an exposed vulnerability in the face of imminent death. On the other hand, We have the cold ones, those who, on the contrary, show a total lack of interest or even pride in their actions. These criminals don't care, they show no remorse, and they often leave their last words as a cry of defiance, a reaffirmation of their identity and their choices. And finally, there are the revelators, those who, perhaps due to psychological pressure or an impulse of relief, make shocking confessions, revealing crimes that were hidden, causing the truth to come to light at the last possible moment. These cases have something enigmatic about them, because they often make us question whether the person was in fact remorseful, or whether they were just trying to mess with others, make an impact, or even ensure a kind of legacy of mystery. But the most fascinating thing is understanding what these words in any of these situations really mean. These are words that go down in history, which can change the public perception of a person, or even generate profound reflections on human nature. They make us think about our own choices, about how we would react in the face of an extreme situation, and in a way, they force us to confront questions of morality, repentance, and the truth that each of us carries with us. Now I want to leave you with this powerful question. If it was your last minute, what would you say? Reflecting on this can be more impactful than anything else, because it brings us face to face with something inevitable and inescapable, the truth of who we are deep down, without masks, without explanations. This could also be the key to understanding anyone's last words, be it a criminal or an ordinary person. What would you do when there is no more time to hide what you really think? Comment there. That makes sense to me. If you have also, stop to reflect on your own choices and the impact they have on the words we choose. So what did you think of these shocking confessions? It remains to reflect on what really goes through someone's mind at the end of their life. If you've made it this far, it's because you really enjoy this type of content, right? So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, because I bring more stories like this for you. Oh, and tell me in the comments, this message was for me, just so I know that you followed everything until the end. And if you liked the video, leave a like. It helps a lot and is a way of showing that we are always connected here. Oh, and there's a really cool video here that will delve even deeper into this universe. Click and stay with me there. See you next time.